The way the conference has gone is it's actually... okay. It has actually made a lot of what I'm about to say redundant, but as I've made the slides and written the text, I'll attempt to get through it reasonably briskly. Why are we here at conference? And specifically, why are we here at this particular presentation? I'd like to think it is because we can all learn from each other. And for the DEBRA groups, it's the opportunity to meet, form bonds, and develop further our experience. Every DEBRA here can learn something from another DEBRA. We value being part of a bigger organisation, and we are all connected with EB in some way. We share a common vision and believe that it is possible to make a difference in the lives of people with EB. How did we start our journeys to becoming a national DEBRA? For most, it started with a single person, sometimes someone with EB, sometimes a parent, sometimes a doctor, and I know of at least 2 cases where it was the dedication of an aunt. One of them, of course, is our New Zealand one. DEBRA Ukraine's start was like that of many DEBRAs. Tetiana from DEBRA Ukraine told me a very familiar story. When DEBRA Ukraine was founded in 2011, there was no medical expertise, no information and no support for EB patients, nothing. Now they have a very, very long list of achievements. Most of you are familiar with the history of DEBRA International, but we're actually fortunate at this conference to have many people who are here for the first time. I've taken a piece from the DEBRA UK website, but Ben gave you a bit of the history of how DEBRA UK started. But here is the woman at the head of it, which is Phyllis Hilton. Ben spoke about her daughter, and so I'll move on. DEBRA Australia was created not long after, in about 1984 or 5, and DEBRA New Zealand followed a few months later. In 1989, the parents of a child with EB in Spain founded a charity. They travelled to the DEBRA UK to learn how to set up a charity and where to start and what to do. This meeting was a very early example of one country learning from another. In 1993, DEBRA Spain was officially founded. In Italy, 1999. From DEBRA UK came a number of other national DEBRAs, all starting out with a similar model. Someone with passion, energy and commitment starts a DEBRA in their own country. How did DEBRA International come to be? There might be an historian within DEBRA International who has more information than I do, and perhaps for another presentation we can look at a timeline from the first DEBRA UK through to our now 50th DEBRA. But briefly, as I understand it, the initial idea to set up a structure for national DEBRA groups to work together came from a meeting in Paris with DEBRAs France, UK and New Zealand. The intention was always that it be an international organisation. Although it was nominally called DEBRA Europe, it's always functioned as a DEBRA International. The reason it was called DEBRA Europe was because at the time there was EU funding available for national groups to work together and to have conferences. And this funding paid for about the first 5 years worth of congresses. But national DEBRA groups were always part of the organisation. So essentially, from DEBRA UK's early days, we have always intended to be an international organisation. So we have had a brief look at where we've come from, and now where do we want to go. When I started putting this presentation together, I tried to make a matrix that included who did what, when, and but for me it just wasn't working to have everything just on a group of charts. And at this conference we've heard from many, many different DEBRA groups who have given you a good overview. So why is it that we want to know what happens in other DEBRAs? Perhaps the goal here is to know what is possible. What if we put everything that's available somewhere together to create a picture of the ultimate DEBRA? Nothing in this DEBRA ultimate is fantasy. Every item exists in at least one established DEBRA somewhere, although not everything is in one DEBRA. Not DEBRA UK, not Ireland, there is no DEBRA that's perfect. Every DEBRA can actually still and is still evolving. Your picture of the ultimate DEBRA might be quite different, or it might be quite similar with additions and subtractions. But hopefully this will be something for everyone to think about. I've skipped one, but some countries have all dressings and medicines fully funded, either by public or private funds. And the way funding has been obtained is very different in different countries. You know, generally speaking, it's years and years and years of lobbying, and the experience I'm obviously most familiar with is DEBRA New Zealand, and this took years and years and years of lobbying. But in for the final moment to happen, there is still an element of luck, or it's just people being prepared to be super, super assertive. Anna and Martin had lobbied for many years, but they also had a friend of a friend who worked in the Prime Minister's office, and who at the time was Helen Clark for New Zealanders. So this friend of a friend let them know that Helen's in her office at the moment, you know, and she's about to go home. There's no one else there. There's not going to be any other meetings. I suggest you get down here. So they were there from their place to Parliament within seconds, banging on the door, basically. But they took in at that stage, it was probably a VHS, and plugged it in, and it was a dressings change. And the Prime Minister signed the document on the spot. So sometimes you have to find some way of making a real personal connection with your politicians. But that's just only one way. I mean, there are lots of other ways. How do you go back? I must have. Right, okay. Other countries have multidisciplinary EB centres of excellence, and the next two slides, that's where I was coming up to, were lent to me by Johannes Kearns, who spoke so eloquently yesterday. And these slides were given to him by permission from Professor Bruckner Thudemann of Freiburg EB Centre in Germany. And now you can see from the lists in those two slides, did I go one or two? And these two slides, it truly is a centre of excellence which has everything. Not all countries have that, of course. Some have funded bandage teams where they have bathers and care teams that go in and do dressing changes for people with EB. Some countries have nurses regularly visiting patients in their home, as you've heard. I mean, DEBRA New Zealand does, but so also does DEBRA Russia. They have a dedicated nurse who spends the whole 12 months travelling across Russia. Some countries have holiday homes where parents and, families can go together simply to maybe have a change of scene. Sometimes it's respite, but it's something that's available. What would you put in the frame? What would your DEBRA Ultimate look like? I've talked about where we've come from, and we've looked at a picture of a DEBRA with everything. What is the link in the chain between our past and our future? Partnership. It's the way DEBRAs have developed in the past, and it's the way DEBRAs will continue to develop in the future. Making new connections and re-establishing connections at Congress is fantastic. And at this particular Congress, I think we have done this more intensely than we do generally. And so I think it's a model that we can work with. But the real value of a conference comes after the conference. What happens with the rest of the year? I'd like to see every DEBRA group partnered with at least one other DEBRA. We need connections. DEBRA International can help with these connections. There are some excellent examples already of DEBRA groups working together. DEBRA Spain has always maintained close ties with Latin American DEBRAs, for example. Regional alliances can be extremely valuable. Russia and Croatia have recently had an exchange of medical teams going between Zagreb and St. Petersburg. And yet we can't assume that a regional model will work in every area. Nearby countries don't always form natural alliances and may have very different approaches. There's a saying, good fences build good neighbours. Partnerships needn't be just with your neighbour. It might be more appropriate to work with a DEBRA geographically far. Many combinations would work really well. And if there are DEBRA groups here that are interested in the concept, then talk to me later or talk to another DEBRA group, or really just be talking. From what I've seen, all DEBRAs share a common vision: to improve the lives of people living with EB. But how DEBRAs go about making that vision a reality can be very different. The connection can be just one person in the organisation. It's not about financial help or sponsoring or even mentoring. It's about exchanging ideas. What do we have in common? What is different? We've had a number of groups join in just the last 5 years. This brings a whole new generation of thought and fresh ideas, and also fresh problems. And this stimulates new and creative ways of overcoming challenges. We want to be talking to each other. We can ask each other, what are you working on at the moment? I've got an issue, perhaps I can use your approach. There are challenges, of course, in all countries. For instance, Germany has 16 states, which means 16 different health ministers. They also have a public health insurance which is fragmented into 40 different companies. These things can't be easy, but they've found a way to make it work. India has many states. Perhaps DEBRA India could be talking to DEBRA Germany about negotiating this one. Contact with different thought processes can be very stimulating. I know that's what we're doing here at Congress, but let's take it beyond these few days. Let's keep the dialogues going, and not only at an organisational level, all of us can maintain our connections. Clinicians, families, researchers, nurses, together with the lyrics that make the song. Building relationships takes time. If we see each other for 5 minutes once a year, how many years is it going to take how many years worth of encounters would we need to forge a relationship, partnership, friendship? Far too many. We need to be communicating on a regular basis. We'll be looking at EB Without Borders, of course, in more depth tomorrow, but I'd like to leave you with these thoughts. We tend to think, because we now have 50 DEBRAs, that were covering the globe, but we clearly are not. Look at the map. We have vast areas that are without a patient support group. And let's not leave the solitary figure alone and isolated. Let's help them to begin their DEBRA journey. Thanks.